Chapter 54, Samson. This chapter is based on Judges 13 to 16.
Amid the widespread apostasy, the faithful worshippers of God continued to plead with him for the deliverance of Israel. Though there was apparently no response, though year after year the power of the oppressor continued to rest more heavily upon the land, God's providence was preparing help for them. Even in the early years of the Philistine oppression, a child was born through whom God designed to humble the power of these mighty foes. On the border of the hill country overlooking the Philistine plain was the little town of Zorah. Here dwelt the family of Manoah of the tribe of Dan, one of the few households that amid the general defection had remained true to Jehovah. To the childless wife of Manoah, the angel of Jehovah appeared with the message that she should have a son, through whom God would begin to deliver Israel. In view of this, the angel gave her instruction concerning her own habits, and also for the treatment of her child. Now therefore beware, I pray thee, and drink not wine nor strong drink, and eat not any unclean thing. And the same prohibition was to be imposed from the first upon the child, with the addition that his hair should not be cut, for he was to be consecrated to God as a Nazirite from his birth. The woman sought her husband, and, after describing the angel, she repeated his message. Then, fearful that they should make some mistake in the important work committed to them, the husband prayed, Let the man of God which thou didst send come again unto us, and teach us what we shall do unto the child that shall be born. When the angel again appeared, Manoah's anxious inquiry was, How shall we order the child, and how shall we do unto him? The previous instruction was repeated. Of all that I said unto the woman, let her beware. She may not eat of anything that cometh of the vine, neither let her drink wine or strong drink, nor eat any unclean thing. All that I commanded her, let her observe. God had an important work for the promised child of Manoah to do, and it was to secure for him the qualifications necessary for this work, that the habits of both the mother and the child were to be carefully regulated. Neither let her drink wine or strong drink, was the angel's instruction for the wife of Manoah, nor eat any unclean thing. All that I commanded her, let her observe. The child will be affected for good or for evil by the habits of the mother. She must herself be controlled by principle, and must practice temperance and self-denial, if she would seek the welfare of her child. Unwise advisers will urge upon the mother the necessity of gratifying every wish and impulse, but such teaching is false and mischievous. The mother is by the command of God himself placed under the most solemn obligation to exercise self-control. And fathers as well as mothers are involved in this responsibility. Both parents transmit their own characteristics, mental and physical, their dispositions and appetites to their children. As a result of parental intemperance, children often lack physical strength and mental and moral power. Liquor drinkers and tobacco users may and do transmit their insatiable craving, their inflamed blood and irritable nerves to their children. The licentious often bequeath their unholy desires, and even loathsome diseases, as a legacy to their offspring. And as the children have less power to resist temptation than had the parents, the tendency is for each generation to fall lower and lower. To a great degree, parents are responsible not only for the violent passions and perverted appetites of their children, but for the infirmities of the thousands born deaf, blind, diseased, or idiotic. The inquiry of every father and mother should be, What shall we do unto the child that shall be born unto us? The effect of prenatal influences has been by many lightly regarded, but the instruction sent from heaven to those Hebrew parents, and twice repeated in the most explicit and solemn manner, shows how this matter is looked upon by our Creator. And it was not enough that the promised child should receive a good legacy from the parents. This must be followed by careful training and the formation of right habits. God directed that the future judge and deliverer of Israel should be trained to strict temperance from infancy. He was to be a Nazirite from his birth, thus being placed under a perpetual prohibition against the use of wine or strong drink. The lessons of temperance, self-denial, and self-control are to be taught to children even from babyhood. The angel's prohibition included every unclean thing. The distinction between articles of food as clean and unclean was not a merely ceremonial and arbitrary regulation, but was based upon sanitary principles. To the observance of this distinction may be traced in a great degree the marvelous vitality which for thousands of years has distinguished the Jewish people. The principles of temperance must be carried further than the mere use of spirituous liquors. The use of stimulating and indigestible food is often equally injurious to health, and in many cases sows the seeds of drunkenness. True temperance teaches us to dispense entirely with everything hurtful, and to use judiciously that which is healthful. There are few who realize, as they should, how much their habits of diet have to do with their health, their character, their usefulness in this world, and their eternal destiny. The appetite should ever be in subjection to the moral and intellectual powers. The body should be servant to the mind, and not the mind to the body. The divine promise to Manoah was in due time fulfilled in the birth of a son, to whom the name of Samson was given. As the boy grew up, it became evident that he possessed extraordinary physical strength. This was not, however, as Samson and his parents well knew, dependent upon his well-knit sinews, but upon his condition as a Nazarite, of which his unshorn hair was a symbol. Had Samson obeyed the divine commands as faithfully as his parents had done, his would have been a nobler and happier destiny. But association with idolaters corrupted him. The town of Zorah being near the country of the Philistines, Samson came to mingle with them on friendly terms. Thus in his youth intimacies sprang up, the influence of which darkened his whole life. A young woman dwelling in the Philistine town of Timnath engaged Samson's affections, and he determined to make her his wife. To his God-fearing parents, who endeavored to dissuade him from his purpose, his only answer was, "She pleaseth me well." The parents at last yielded to his wishes, and the marriage took place. Just as he was entering upon manhood, the time when he must execute his divine mission, the time above all others when he should have been true to God, Samson connected himself with the enemies of Israel. He did not ask whether he could better glorify God when united with the object of his choice, or whether he was placing himself in a position where he could not fulfill the purpose to be accomplished by his life. To all who seek first to honor him, God has promised wisdom, but there is no promise to those who are bent upon self-pleasing. How many are pursuing the same course as did Samson? How often marriages are formed between the godly and the ungodly, because inclination governs in the selection of husband or wife. The parties do not ask counsel of God, nor have his glory in view. Christianity ought to have a controlling influence upon the marriage relation, but it is too often the case that the motives which lead to this union are not in keeping with Christian principles. Satan is constantly seeking to strengthen his power over the people of God by inducing them to enter into alliance with his subjects, and in order to accomplish this, he endeavors to arouse unsanctified passions in the heart. But the Lord has in his word plainly instructed his people not to unite themselves with those who have not his love abiding in them. What concord hath Christ with Belial, or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 15 and 16. At his marriage feast, Samson was brought into familiar association with those who hated the God of Israel. Whoever voluntarily enters into such relations will feel it necessary to conform, to some degree, to the habits and customs of his companions. The time thus spent is worse than wasted. Thoughts are entertained and words are spoken that tend to break down the strongholds of principle and to weaken the citadel of the soul. The wife to obtain whom Samson had transgressed the command of God proved treacherous to her husband before the close of the marriage feast. Incensed at her perfidy, Samson forsook her for the time and went alone to his home at Zorah. When afterward relenting he returned for his bride, he found her the wife of another. His revenge in the wasting of all the fields and vineyards of the Philistines provoked them to murder her, although their threats had driven her to the deceit with which the trouble began. Samson had already given evidence of his marvelous strength by slaying single-handed a young lion and by killing 30 of the men of Askelon. Now, moved to anger by the barbarous murder of his wife, he attacked the Philistines and smote them with a great slaughter. Then, wishing a safe retreat from his enemies, he withdrew to the rock Etam in the tribe of Judah. To this place he was pursued by a strong force, and the inhabitants of Judah, in great alarm, basely agreed to deliver him to his enemies. Accordingly, 3,000 men of Judah went up to him. But even at such odds they would not have dared approach him had they not felt assured that he would not harm his own countrymen. Samson consented to be bound and delivered to the Philistines, but first exacted from the men of Judah a promise not to attack him themselves, and thus compel him to destroy them. He permitted them to bind him with 2 new ropes, and he was led into the camp of his enemies amid demonstrations of great joy. But while their shouts were waking the echoes of the hills, the Spirit of Jehovah came mightily upon him. He burst asunder the strong new cords as if they had been flax burned in the fire. Then, seizing the first weapon at hand, which, though only the jawbone of an ass, was rendered more effective than sword or spear, he smote the Philistines until they fled in terror, leaving 1,000 men dead upon the field. Had the Israelites been ready to unite with Samson and follow up the victory, they might at this time have freed themselves from the power of their oppressors. But they had become dispirited and cowardly. They had neglected the work which God commanded them to perform in dispossessing the heathen, and had united with them in their degrading practices, tolerating their cruelty, and so long as it was not directed against them, even countenancing their injustice. When themselves brought under the power of the oppressor, they tamely submitted to the degradation which they might have escaped, had they only obeyed God. Even when the Lord raised up a deliverer for them, they would, not infrequently, desert him and unite with their enemies. After his victory, the Israelites made Samson judge, and he ruled Israel for 20 years. But one wrong step prepares the way for another. Samson had transgressed the command of God by taking a wife from the Philistines. And again he ventured among them, now his deadly enemies, in the indulgence of unlawful passion. Trusting to his great strength, which had inspired the Philistines with such terror, he went boldly to Gaza to visit a harlot of that place. The inhabitants of the city learned of his presence, and they were eager for revenge. Their enemy was shut safely within the walls of the most strongly fortified of all their cities. They felt sure of their prey, and only waited till the morning to complete their triumph. At midnight Samson was aroused. The accusing voice of conscience filled him with remorse, as he remembered that he had broken his vow as a Nazirite. But notwithstanding his sin, God's mercy had not forsaken him. His prodigious strength again served to deliver him. Going to the city gate, he wrenched it from its place and carried it with its posts and bars to the top of a hill on the way to Hebron. But even this narrow escape did not stay his evil course. He did not again venture among the Philistines, but he continued to seek those sensuous pleasures that were luring him to ruin. He loved a woman in the valley of Zorek, not far from his own birthplace. Her name was Delilah, the consumer. The vale of Zorek was celebrated for its vineyards. These had a temptation for the wavering Nazirite, who had already indulged in the use of wine, thus breaking another tie that bound him to purity and to God. The Philistines kept a vigilant watch over the movements of their enemy, and when he degraded himself by this new attachment, they determined through Delilah to accomplish his ruin. A deputation consisting of one leading man from each of the Philistine provinces was sent to the vale of Zorek. They dared not attempt to seize him while in possession of his great strength, but it was their purpose to learn, if possible, the secret of his power. They therefore bribed Delilah to discover and reveal it. As the betrayer plied Samson with her questions, he deceived her by declaring that the weakness of other men would come upon him if certain processes were tried. When she put the matter to the test, the cheat was discovered. Then she accused him of falsehood, saying, "How canst thou say, I love thee, when thine heart is not with me? Thou hast mocked me these 3 times, and hast not told me wherein thy great strength lieth." 3 times Samson had the clearest evidence that the Philistines had leagued with his charmer to destroy him. But when her purpose failed, she treated the matter as a jest, and he blindly banished fear. Day by day Delilah urged him until his soul was vexed unto death. Yet a subtle power kept him by her side. Overcome at last, Samson made known the secret. "There hath not come a razor upon mine head, for I have been a Nazarite unto God from my mother's womb. If I be shaven, then my strength will go from me, and I shall become weak, and be like any other man." A messenger was immediately dispatched to the lords of the Philistines, urging them to come to her without delay. While the warrior slept, the heavy masses of his hair were severed from his head. Then, as she had done 3 times before, she called, "The Philistines be upon thee, Samson!" Suddenly awakening, he thought to exert his strength as before and destroy them. But his powerless arms refused to do his bidding, and he knew that Jehovah was departed from him. When he had been shaven, Delilah began to annoy him and cause him pain, thus making a trial of his strength, for the Philistines dared not approach him till fully convinced that his power was gone. Then they seized him, and, having put out both his eyes, they took him to Gaza. Here he was bound with fetters in their prison house, and confined to hard labor. What a change to him who had been the judge and champion of Israel! Now weak, blind, imprisoned, degraded to the most menial service. Little by little he had violated the conditions of his sacred calling. God had borne long with him, but when he had so yielded himself to the power of sin as to betray his secret, the Lord departed from him. There was no virtue in his long hair merely, but it was a token of his loyalty to God, and when the symbol was sacrificed in the indulgence of passion, the blessings of which it was a token were also forfeited. In suffering and humiliation, a sport for the Philistines, Samson learned more of his own weakness than he had ever known before, and his afflictions led him to repentance. As his hair grew, his power gradually returned, but his enemies, regarding him as a fettered and helpless prisoner, felt no apprehensions. The Philistines ascribed their victory to their gods, and, exulting, they defied the God of Israel. A feast was appointed in honor of Dagon, the fish god, the protector of the sea. From town and country throughout the Philistine plain the people and their lords assembled. Throngs of worshippers filled the vast temple, and crowded the galleries about the roof. It was a scene of festivity and rejoicing. There was the pomp of the sacrificial service, followed by music and feasting. Then, as a crowning trophy of Dagon's power, Samson was brought in. Shouts of exultation greeted his appearance. People and rulers mocked his misery and adored the God who had overthrown the destroyer of their country. After a time, as if weary, Samson asked permission to rest against the 2 central pillars which supported the temple roof. Then he silently uttered the prayer, "O Lord God, remember me, I pray thee, and strengthen me, I pray thee, only this once, O God, that I may be at once avenged of the Philistines." With these words he encircled the pillars with his mighty arms, and crying, "Let me die with the Philistines," he bowed himself, and the roof fell, destroying at one crash all that vast multitude. So the dead which he slew at his death were more than they which he slew in his life. The idol and its worshippers, priest and peasant, warrior and noble, were buried together beneath the ruins of Dagon's temple, and among them was the giant form of him whom God had chosen to be the deliverer of his people. Tidings of the terrible overthrow were carried to the land of Israel, and Samson's kinsmen came down from their hills, and, unopposed, rescued the body of the fallen hero. And they brought him up, and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol, in the burying place of Manoah his father. God's promise that through Samson he would begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines was fulfilled. But how dark and terrible the record of that life which might have been a praise to God and a glory to the nation. Had Samson been true to his divine calling, the purpose of God could have been accomplished in his honor and exaltation. But he yielded to temptation and proved untrue to his trust, and his mission was fulfilled in defeat, bondage, and death. Physically, Samson was the strongest man upon the earth, but in self-control, integrity, and firmness, he was one of the weakest of men. Many mistake strong passions for a strong character, but the truth is that he who is mastered by his passions is a weak man. The real greatness of the man is measured by the power of the feelings that he controls, not by those that control him. God's providential care had been over Samson, that he might be prepared to accomplish the work which he was called to do. At the very outset of life he was surrounded with favorable conditions for physical strength, intellectual vigor, and moral purity. But under the influence of wicked associates, he let go that hold upon God which is man's only safeguard, and he was swept away by the tide of evil. Those who in the way of duty are brought into trial may be sure that God will preserve them. But if men willfully place themselves under the power of temptation, they will fall sooner or later. The very ones whom God purposes to use as his instruments for a special work, Satan employs his utmost power to lead astray. He attacks us at our weak points, working through defects in the character to gain control of the whole man. And he knows that if these defects are cherished, he will succeed. But none need be overcome. Man is not left alone to conquer the power of evil by his own feeble efforts. Help is at hand, and will be given to every soul who really desires it. Angels of God that ascend and descend the ladder which Jacob saw in vision will help every soul who will to climb even to the highest heaven.